Great. Well, thank you both. And we have 4 trios, so I realistically may not get through all those. I'll confess I won't keep scanning the room that intently for additional people. The first group will be Chris Green, Stephen Sachs, and Fred Schauer. So, Chris.
Okay, so just 2 quick thoughts. So if law is something we do as opposed to something we have, it seems somebody who believes that shouldn't take the Article 6 oath, because it says that, this Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. So Wittgenstein and Quine and his other followers shouldn't take the Article 6 oath, but Gottlob Frege, Greiss, Strauss, and Chalmers, Carnap, they can all take it. The majority of philosophers, I think 64% in the Phil survey, they agree with the analytic synthetic distinction. It's a dogma that has been defended ably by Greiss and Strauss. Second thought, it seems like understanding the Constitution, it's not learning a game. It's like learning a foreign language. So I look at this Dutch translation and, I'm like, ooh, what is that? Is that German? Oh, no, it's Dutch. There's Dutch words. There's a difference. Languages can be dead, right? So, and I think you look at the Constitution, what is this written? Well, it looks like English. What kind of English? It's got words like now, referring to 1788. It's got phrases like the time of the adoption of this Constitution, referring to 1788. It's written in 1788-ese. Even if 1788-ese is a dead language, seems like the Constitution could be written in it, just like it could be written in Latin.
So my question follows a lot from Chris's. I think you do an able job of showing that originalism is not necessarily true. But I worry that your argument sometimes veers into trying to show that originalism is impossible, when what I think you mean to say is just that it's contingently false. And with regard to the foreign languages, a lot of what you say about this sort of form of life and so on, I think must be wrong if what you're trying to argue is that we cannot possibly have older language or older legal rules as part of our law today. I mean, people that, there are lots of books about ancient Greek, and although we can't be sure that we're getting all the jokes, you can actually learn it reasonably well if you spend enough time on it. So it's not impossible to recover these things. It's just often fraught. And sometimes we do have legal rules that require us to refer to the past. So ex post facto is an excellent example. If I have a murder from the 1960s, I need to know what the penalty was as of the 1960s. And that requires recourse to what was the law at the time, which I'm commanded by present law to apply. And so the real question is just, to what extent does present law require us to apply these things? I have 2 papers, and I think Will's paper, together argue that in fact it does. But from what I took from your response to Larry, it's hard for me to figure out whether what you're saying is that it is impossible to show that one approach trumps the others, because doing so requires resort to sort of outside sources, or rather just that when I look at the corpus of judicial opinions and other statements made by legal actors, it so happens that on this evidence no approach does, and so if one wants to make such an argument, one needs other resources. I think that it is not clear to me that your entire article is wrong-headed, but it would be useful to draw out the elements and make clear where your commitments are to avoid that conclusion.
So, first, 2 tiny bibliographical footnotes. One of the things that Carl Llewellyn insisted on for many decades was that law, properly understood, is a craft. And as a craft, it was not nearly as rule-based as his opponents thought. People have written about Llewellyn and law as craft and that as well. Just to repeat something I mentioned yesterday, Brian Simpson's Common Law and Legal Theory rejects the rule-based understanding of the rule of recognition, saying that what we accept and what we do not accept as valid law or valid legal argument is a matter of practice in just your sense. And I think you'd find both of these sympathetic. So my question. Wittgenstein said rather famously, ordinary language is all right as it is. That is one way of understanding Wittgenstein and perhaps some of his legal academy followers like Patterson is saying that, like Wittgenstein's view about language, this exists at bedrock. It's just what it is. We can't go any further. Does that apply to law? Is it so obvious that it applies to law? So you have a nice example of the 10 of spades. Can I not say the 10 of spades is an ugly card? Can I not say bridge would be a better game if it didn't have tens? So yes, it may be that as a descriptive project, we can say this is what the practice is now, but to draw on Wittgenstein too much may suggest that it is not a practice that's subject to external criticism, and that seems unfaithful also to our practices about law, about legal scholarship, about legal criticism.
So good question, I'll try to.
And to put all of this, there's a common phrase that I guess people a lot younger than I am use these days. It is what it is. Maybe that's a Wittgensteinian thing, but I'm not sure whether it actually applies here.
Okay. I think that's Belichick, not Wittgenstein, but similar. Okay, so a couple questions. To start with Chris. Right, I guess it depends what you think the definition of upholding the law is, right? And so the law cannot, the point is, the law can't self-execute, right? So somebody has to interpret the law to apply it to circumstances in the real world. And so if interpreting the law is to uphold the Constitution, then that's what the oath is requiring, that you interpret the law. And then we have to look beyond that to what are the accepted practices of interpreting the law to determine whether we're in fact following the law by the interpretation we're giving, right? And so I agree that it's easier, right, if you're, Grice or Strawson or whoever, to sort of say the law is this fixed thing and I'm going to apply it. But I don't think it's quite honest to what actually happens. The law doesn't have any meaning outside of the interpretive practice. And so the best we can do is describe the interpretive practice that we actually consider legitimate. And if that's originalist, then that meaning of the law being upheld is valid. If it's not originalist, then non-originalist interpretive practices are equally the law, is my point. And the foreign language thing, I think it's a good point. I would just say a foreign language is a game, right? So when you say it's not a game, it's a foreign language, it's a kind of language game. And the point about dead languages is, yes, right, you have to translate, but translation is a constructive act, right? And that's exactly the point I'm making here. To actually do the semantic act, you have to be in the game. So in other words, if I read a dead language and it's only to myself, I'm trying to compare sources that I don't have anybody to speak with, right? I may get one version of the game, but it's a constructed version of the game. It's the one that I've come up with. And it's not the sort of practical, practiced version of the game that I think I at least take from the idea of semantic content, right? That may not satisfy you. And I guess to Steve is sort of the same point on the translation is constructive, right? So my point is not that we're not going back and trying to recover some things about history when we're playing our modern language game. It's that I think that all those things we're discovering are in fact constructive enterprises, right? So there's not any sort of science of this. There's not a adjusted, pure way to construct this. I know there are better ways and worse ways, but it's still construction, right? And bobbing on the modalities, so yeah, you're right. I do slip back and forth between making the claim it's impossible and it's not what we do. And I think the much stronger claim is that it's not what we do, right? I also am of the view that it's not at a fine-grained level possible for the same reasons that translation is a constructive act. So when I say that Bobbitt, his version of the modalities is flat by necessity, right? That's not necessarily my view, that's Bobbitt's view. But his point, if you buy it, is that to make claims about the ascendancy of particular modalities, you have to do something outside of the practice, right? So you can do it, right? It's not that it's impossible to do it, but it just requires something in a different language game. And so I've argued that values, so when I say, why should originalism be the preferred choice of interpretive theory in this particular case, There may be lots of good reasons why it should be, right? But that those reasons, I think it would be better to justify, not in terms of just within the originalist modality, right? But in terms of saying, why is originalism good for our Constitution, right? And that's what I take sort of the adjudicative claims to be making, is that, and I try to give a normative claim that I don't think it's always good for our Constitution to be bound to something. But that's the point. It's not that it's impossible. It's just that it requires a interposition of values that are not necessarily inherent in the game itself, unless it's the law. And finally, I take the craft point. I'll look to Brian Simpson and Carl Llewellyn. I've used craft before, but as I'm so hopelessly devoted to Bob, I've used practice. And what was the last part of the question? I've forgotten that.
I worry that you use Wittgenstein too easily because he assumed that,
Got it.
the bedrock point.
I got it, right.
Yeah.
So I start that other paper about the values with the quote about the spade being turned, right? And the point is, there again, it's not that you can't say the 10 of spades is ugly or, we ought not use 10s in this game, but those are things outside the game, right? That's not part of playing the card game, right? There could be lots of reasons why we would try to change the cards. Italian cards are prettier, and those would be very perfectly good reasons. They're just not internal to the practice of the game. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I'm not sure what follows from it.
Okay.
That is, it may be that it is a characteristic of law that the practitioners, in the broadest sense, are engaged in simultaneously a practice of being inside it but also reconstructing it, and in order to reconstruct it, you have to be partly outside it.
That, I think, is the claim. That we're doing that, and we ought to make that explicit. Right, that's the claim. So you could say the 10 of spades is ugly, and that may be true, right? And we are doing that in certain ways in law all the time, right? But that's not part of what we understand ourselves to be doing when we apply the law or interpret the law, right?
Okay, so we should go on to our next group, and Christina Mulligan, Steve Smith, and Randy Barnett are the next trio. So Christina?
So I was really struck by your argument that we're not really doing originalism when we look at the easy cases and when we look at the domestic violence case. And so I wanted to throw out a hypothetical that I think is harder to wrestle with. So we could imagine that the Constitution had been written in a time where Fahrenheit is our temperature, and we say we're not going to do the inauguration outside if it's less than 10 degrees, period, right? And then 1970 comes and we all go metric. And so, now we're doing Celsius. And 100 years later, most people don't remember that it was ever anything different. It is perfectly reasonable to read 10 degrees, believe it is 10 degrees Celsius, and think that is a totally reasonable temperature to hold it inside or whatnot. It strikes me, and granted this is hypothetical, so you can push it here, but as vanishingly implausible that we would change the temperature at which we would, allow the inauguration to be outside or inside, based on the fact that we had changed what the numbers mean. And it seems that there's no untortured way of explaining the fact that we're hewing to the old standard besides that we are doing originalism and doing it correctly. So I'm just curious if that works for you.
So this question, I guess, does build on questions that a number of people asked already, but here's one way of trying to focus this. So some of the discussion suggests that I think people have referred to at least roughly like 3 categories of originalism now seem to be emerging, people. So there's like the positivist version, which is new, but that Will represents here. And it seems to me that your paper can be read as directly challenging that version of originalism. I mean, if you're right, then, that would undermine that version of originalism. Then there are versions of originalism based on theories of interpretation. I think, Larry Alexander might be a good representative of that interpretation just in general necessarily involves reading a text to ascertain the intentions of the authors. And I guess I think your Wittgensteinian approach could be seen as directly trying to challenge that version. But then there are normative theories of originalism, normative versions that basically, and I think these actually are probably the most common ones and the ones that animated the movement from the beginning, that something like originalism is the best way, is the method of a constitutional interpretation that's most consistent with assumptions about democratic authority or something of that sort. And I don't see how your paper challenges those. In fact, from that point of view, your paper reads in a kind of odd way because much of the paper says, well, this isn't what our current practice is. And you might say, normative originals, I take it, would say, that's what we're talking about. I mean, that's what generated the movement in the first place. We know that. How is that inconsistent with this version of originalism? In response, I think you have agreed in response to Stephen Sachs that it's not really impossible to do that kind of originalism. You say you like to do history itself, and a strong reading of your version might say that's impossible. You can't really do it, but that would be an untenable sort of position. Or you say, but if we do that, we're still sort of constructing in some sense. But I'm not quite sure what the sting is there. I mean, you might say, all human conceptual activity is constructive in some sense, but what do you get out of that? So would it be fair to say your paper could be read as challenging sort of two versions of originalism, but leaving a third category completely intact and, if anything, reinforced?
The third dogma.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. And I believe Randy finished up this group.
I think my comments are going to echo some of what I said earlier today. I pick up on page 33 of your paper where you say, once we recognize with Fallon that the constraint principle would replace well-worn interpretive traditions with a normative theory imposed from without, it is not too great a leap to understand originalism as a radical kind of movement, a movement born in reaction to the perceived extravagances of the Warren and Burger courts. So you place, your whole account depends on your claim about well-worn interpretive traditions, which is a narrative. So your whole account depends on the truth of the narrative that you present in this paper. And first of all, at the very minimum, it's contestable. But secondly, I think it just might be wrong. And if your narrative is wrong, then you're wrong. And the narrative here is that there was somehow a well-worn normative interpretive tradition that somehow is now being abandoned, or only started to be abandoned when Ed Meese and Ronald Reagan became president. When another way, I think, the more accurate, because now we're talking about what's true, so I make a contrary. The more accurate claim is that the Warren and Burger courts were a sharp deviation from our well-worn interpretive traditions, and the election of Ronald Reagan represents a political response to this. I myself like most of what the Warren and Burger courts did, and in the areas that raised the most hackles at the time, their criminal procedure areas that I think they were right about, the privacy stuff I think they were right about. But when you teach this stuff and you actually read what they say, they were doing something else that people say. They were MOS. They were making up shit. They were just making it up. Or pulling it out, so to speak, of their butt. And it's sort of like they discovered they could do this. And there wasn't anybody to stop them. Because they were the Supreme Court, so they could just make up shit, and it stuck. It was, what was this phrase? Something, rule of law, or whatever that phrase is. That in your paper? It was in somebody's paper. Anyway, so that was Podesta's executive order thing. So signature on a paper, rule. It's a rule of law. Hey, isn't this cool? Well, they thought it was cool. Now it elicited a political response. Now, this claim, this competing narrative, that this really was a deviation from which there's been a restoration rather than a revolution, restoration versus revolution is the theme going on here, is supported by, I think, your mischaracterization of the Commerce Clause stuff that happens earlier in the paper. I don't think it's true that the Supreme Court ever changed the meaning of the word commerce, except in one case, Southeastern Underwriters, which I'll say something about in a second. But with respect to the New Deal, they never reinterpreted the word commerce. All the New Deal cases that expanded the scope of what we call the Commerce Clause were necessary and proper clause cases. They were all based on the authority of McCulloch. They were not based on a reinterpretation of Gibbons. I learned all this stuff. I had to learn it to litigate the Raich case, and then it turned out to pay off a bit in litigating the NFIB case, because that was a necessary and proper clause case. If you go back to those New Deal cases, they say, though it be not commerce, Congress may reach this anyway because of the effect that it has on commerce. They don't change the meaning of the word. Now, the exception to this is Southeast Underwriters, because in an originalist opinion by Justice Black of all people, it's just a hatchet job. It's more making up stuff, only it's making up originalist stuff. So it's a very weak, thin, where they say, okay, insurance is in. Insurance contracts are in. So they do expand. Insurance contracts probably weren't in the first place. And so there was an expansion there. It's the only expansion I'm aware of. So even your example of a specific example of where things have changed, they haven't changed. What changed was our scope of the necessary and proper clause. That's more contestable, even on originalist grounds. That's a harder thing to row because of what McCulloch might or might not have meant, or what the bank case was or was not about. So, but it's not an example, I think, of the abandonment of this long tradition of hewing to the original meaning of the text, which there was a brief deviation from, and due to a political response, there's been a partial restoration of this original approach, and hopefully it will get better before it gets worse again. But it's narrative all the way down, right?
So I wouldn't use the word, I would say descriptive. But yes, I mean, I think you're hitting on the point, and I'm going to go in reverse order here. Obviously, I've already started. Yes, it's true that if my description is wrong, right, then my account of whether or not the semantic meaning is our practice and whether that's binding is wrong, right? So that's why I think maybe it's a roundabout way of saying if Will is right, then I'm wrong, right? Now, on the point of, I'll leave you to the commerce stuff, right? I trust your judgment far more on the Commerce Clause, and maybe I got that wrong. My point there was to say that we don't usually today hear that. We do, I mean, Scalia writes concurrence to point out, this is the necessary and proper clause, right, in Raich, but that maybe in common, ordinary public meaning is not the way we think about it. But you maybe I'll leave that aside, you may be right. The other point about restoration versus revolution, I think I actually agree with you. So I have no sort of normative, well, in this part of the paper, I have no normative dog in the fight, right? If the practice decides that we want to be originalist, right, then that's what the practice decides, and then originalism is the law, right? And then we're doing that, right? So to the degree that restoration is happening, and to the degree that one day there is a pretty firm and easily identifiable commitment to original public meaning, then my paper falls away and I do the burn it thing, right? But to the degree that it's not the practice, right, then I don't think we can count it as the law, and then that normative judgment for it falls away. Right? And I also don't think it's the language game practice of actually how we go back and discover the communicative content of the words. So that's that. Back to the 10-degree example, right? That's a good example, right? That's a much harder example. I'm tempted to say that there would be some moment, right, where we would identify that we're switching to go metric, right, and that there would be some thing generated to say we're now, using metric degrees, or we would. I don't really know how to answer the example. It's a good one, right? My temptation, just from the basic paper form, is to say, well, our modern practices of language would be such that when the word was ambiguous, degrees, and we don't know what kind of degrees, we would have to go back and resolve that ambiguity, right, through Fahrenheit or Celsius, right? And that's fine. That's a part of our modern practice, right? That's a part of our modern practice of language. That's how we get meaning out of that. And that makes sense of the meaning today. That doesn't mean that we're in some way bound, right, to use original content. We are in that case, but not necessarily in other cases where there's not ambiguity. So maybe this goes back to the clear text thing. I don't think that when you want to overcome clear text with other modalities of argument, if the text is clear today, non-ambiguous today, right, then I don't think we have any disagreement, right? It's when you say that, well, it was ambiguous. Well, I don't know if I can follow that out. But the point I want to make is just that I think our first reference is to the clear text today, right? We do the language game on the clear text today, and then if that text has ambiguities that make us resort to historical things, we do that, but that's part of the game today. That's not a determinative part of how we interpret all kinds of law. That makes sense. Maybe it doesn't. I felt like that was pretty scrambled. Last point, positive originalism, intentionalism. Originalism is not the practice, right? This is sort of the point I was trying to make to Will, right, earlier, that, well, if all these cases are originalist, then what's happened to originalism, right? I do try to make a normative claim at the end about there may be good reasons not to inject, not to do the revolution, right? Not to do the revolution form of originalism. Right? Not to do the French Revolution of originalism. There may be good reasons to allow, if originalism is going to come out, it's going to come out of our lived practices, right? So my complaint is not that originalism is not a good way to interpret the law. Normatively, it might produce very good results, right? But that to interpose against our practices, as a revolutionary act, is dangerous, right? So if we wait 10 years, and certainly you can influence these things from the outside, conferences like this make more people originalists all the time, and to the degree that happens, right, then I'm all in favor of that restoration, right? Does that make sense? I feel like that, you got me over there, but.
With apologies, Larry, I should let Larry step in. I was hurtling through the trios here and a little worrisome, so Larry should get some extra time.
I just want to make a point about what work the idea of a language game or a complex practice can actually do, right? So we can re-describe what we're doing in Wittgensteinian terms, but the notion of a language game can't yield the conclusion that we are unable to understand changes in the way words are used, right? That's Christina's point. The notion that law is a practice or a language game can't disable us from making normative arguments about why the language game should change. That's Steve Smith's point. The notion of a language game, or the idea that law is a practice, that can't prevent Will Bode from arguing that internal to the practice, there is an ordering, a structure of the modalities, right? It could prevent us from making arguments that somehow purport to go outside all of our practices, but no one is arguing that.
Right. Well, I would just say in terms of, that's why I think on both these, I think if Will's right, then I'm out of luck. That is the practice.
All right, and our next group we have up is David Moore, Jeff Pojanowski, and Will Bode. I have Judge McConnell joining the queue. Did you want to join also, Larry? Yeah. Okay.
You can come harass me later.
Let's hurry then. So, David, I believe.
To return briefly to E.E. Cummings' example, Larry explained that as involving different language games than constitutional interpretation. I think there may be another factor there that we need to pay attention to the intent of the utterer as to clarity, right? Because sometimes we speak to obfuscate, sometimes we speak to invite to reflection and not reach a particular communication. And that may be characteristic of certain language games, but may not be, right? You may get a range of intentions as to clarity within language games. And so I think that may be another factor that needs to be considered. Also, sometimes it was unclear to me whether your argument was that originalism doesn't work or originalism is improperly practiced. So, for example, there's a notation that practitioners don't engage in step one. And it seems to me that's used to say semantic meaning cannot be fixed, right? And of course, they don't follow, right? And so I think there needs to be care there. I also wonder whether there is at least a partial solution on the horizon. You mentioned Randy's article where he does this exhaustive search to identify the meaning of commerce. And there's this emerging field of corpus linguistics, right, that engages in that practice in sort of a methodologically established way, where, we create corpora of naturally occurring language, and then we can look at collocates and see over the decades how, lady used to be sort of genteel, now it's lady of the night, as the decades, progress. And so I wonder if fixing semantic meaning, there are tools coming online, right, to help us with that process. And as a side note, one of the top corpus linguistics is at BYU in the law school, sort of developing long linguistics. So we'll be having a conference training in this field if anyone is interested. So you don't have to try and do what Randy did. My last point ties also into Randy's. I felt like sort of the narrative part of this became really prominent on page 31 and after, right? That we start relying on these well-worn interpretive traditions, sort of the just trust judges. They have a tool bag, right? Without knowing whether, for eye surgery they've got a sledgehammer, right? Just sort of trust they've got it. And so I think that became very prominent to me and sort of less well-reasoned or less well-supported, I should say, as sort of at the latter end of the paper.
And then Jeff?
Just building on what some other people said, I don't feel qualified to comment on the first part of the paper because I don't know philosophy of language very well. On the normative part of the paper, this kind of follows up on Steve. I'm not sure you do lay a glove on people who are originalists for normative grounds. I think of Henry Monahan's article, Our Perfect Constitution, and I read the back end of your paper, and I think it's like our perfect practice. It turns out, it turns out our modalities don't require originalism, and that's awesome. Therefore, we shouldn't change our modalities. And so you either have to have an argument about why we can't intervene on the practice and try to change it for normative reasons. So you either have to have that argument, and there's an argument for there. You kind of hint at Burke and Oakeshott, or you could say, but your fallback could be, well, if that argument wins, the practice changes, and therefore originalism is okay, which leads me to think it's not a very powerful normative argument at all. It just happens to be a snapshot of what we're doing now, and well, I'm going to keep on arguing and try to get people to be originalists. And speaking of, and if you're gonna play the tradition game too, I mean. If you go back to the way Aquinas looked at the nature of law and the nature of constitutions, you have the authoritative intent of a lawmaker with responsibility to the community is what's going to promote the common good, and that's the best way to kind of structure a political system. And you can get an originalist argument from that, and so you're the interregnum now too. I don't know. I think you either need to flesh out I think you need to do a little bit more work on the second dogma, and I don't feel qualified to say whether you've got a glove on the first dogma or not.
So obviously I think I'm right and you're wrong, but I'm more interested actually in what happens if you're right. So if our modalities are flat, so to speak, and there's no hierarchy, I wonder if you have a view, and is it the same as Bobbitt's view, and what is Bobbitt's view about how to think about how they interact? So if you are a Supreme Court justice who happens to like originalism, you'd like originalism to be the only modality. Are you allowed to just do that? Sort of, can you say, well, sure, we have a couple things. We have originalism, we have precedent, we have make it up, or whatever the methods are. I'm just going to do originalism all the time. It's one of the modalities. It's already part of the law, so I'm not engaged in a revolution. I'm not using the other ones, but so what? So I take it, Bobbitt seems to say that's fine, because he says there's no way to criticize, to say one modality dominates the other, which presumably means there's no way to criticize somebody who refuses to use any other modality. Although then he also says that that's bad, that it's ideologizing a modality, at least to use only originalism, but I'm not sure why. So I guess I wonder, do you have a view about how Justice Scalia or Justice Thomas should behave?
Let me go backwards again, because I really like that question. So thank you. Much easier than 10 degrees. Not easier, but more, I like it better. I think I kind of share Bobbitt's view, so let me just give it that way. I don't think he has anything normative to say at all about the interaction of the modalities, right? His is a purely descriptive claim, right? And that's how he's sort of Wittgensteinian. This is what we do, right? And to the extent that it's bad to only do one modality, it's maybe bad from his perspective, but he doesn't think it's bad from some sort of God's eye perspective of how to do interpretive theory. I think he may sense that in the end, that practice is frowned upon, and we think that's a bad judge, and future judges don't do it like that because the practice doesn't reward that kind of judging, right, or doesn't promote it, right? The practice sort of legitimates itself over time, is kind of the Bobbitt claim. And I know that's terribly unsatisfying to everybody, right, that it is sort of what it is, right, and as we said, and it doesn't solve any problems. So how does Bobbitt solve that interaction? He, famously, or maybe not that famously, but unsatisfyingly resorts to just judicial decision, right? We have judges, and the judges, that's what the particular arete of a judge is to figure out, right, the best way to, construct these modal arguments to reach a decision that is the best thing for the Constitution given our practice, right? Now, I know that to people who want to constrain judges, that's terrifying, right? And that's why it's not very satisfying. I would argue that there is actually a constraint in the long run on judges that do the practice badly, right? It may be a very long time coming, right? But there are opinions that fall into the anti-canon, and they fall into the anti-canon for a variety of reasons. And there's opinions that are elevated to the canon, and so the practice over time recognizes good judging and bad judging. I know that doesn't help when you're in front of the court. David, I think all great points, and I'm really interested in the question about the corpus linguistic stuff. I don't know what I feel about that. As you can see, I'm sort of torn between the it's impossible and maybe it's possible, but it's certainly not what we do, right? And I guess I feel like maybe it is possible, and maybe that's the way it's possible, right? So I'm just interested to see what that produces, right? If that produces a bunch of practice around doing that, then that's, that'll be very interesting. The normative stuff, right? Yeah, I don't have much of a normative claim either, right? So to be honest, the Burke stuff, as I was telling somebody else, kind of thrown in there at the end. At the recommendation of somebody else at a conference, you need some account. Maybe you could say that revolutions are bad and you shouldn't be doing this fast, right? You should allow the practice to generate its own norms, right? And that's really where I am. But I'm trying to reply in some normative way to people who think, no, don't let the practice go another day like this, right? I want to say that's not the right approach. The right approach is to practice within the practice and get the practice to change, right?
Okay, so I'm going to give Larry a chance to step in if he wishes. We got about 15 minutes left, and we still have Mike Rappaport, Matt Adler, Richard Ray, and then Judge McConnell and Larry, so.
Let's just
go for
move
it.
on.
Okay, move on. So Mike Rappaport, Matt Adler, and Richard Ray. Mike.
Okay, so I wanted to ask, talk more specifically. Let's say, hypothetically, or maybe not hypothetically, that the New Deal didn't just change the substantive rules of constitutional law, but also change the modalities. So how would you think about this both from the interpretive and the normative perspective? So what are we supposed to say about that change? It's not a constitutional moment, it's a modality moment. Sorry?
I think that would be a constitutional modality moment. Sorry.
It's always wrong to depart from the rules. So anyway, first of all, how would you want to think about that? Do we have is there a modality about how we think about that in the sense that, the New Deal in some sense purported to justify itself with original meaning and in other senses didn't. So first of all, and is that a modality where we can't take the modality to be honestly claiming what it's, so that's first. And then secondly, if we talk about the normative stuff, well, that was a pretty big revolution, not exactly Burkean. So wouldn't your normative stuff have to suggest, hey, the New Deal, really problematic?
Matt?
For a comment on Will's question, which is maybe a friendly, a tool for you. Hart has so Will's question is, let's imagine there are plurality of modalities. So what does that mean for what any one judge can do, and how can any other judge sort of criticize the use of modalities she doesn't like? Hart is a general diagnosis of the situation which applies here, right? So Dworkin says there are always legally right answers, right? Part of Dworkin's claims there are always legally right answers. That's in response to Hart, who says no. There are lots of cases in which there might not be legally right answers. Hart's not needless. Hart says there can be legally right answers, but for lots of reasons, for various reasons, there might not be legally correct answers. One reason, right, is open texture, right? So a word just has open texture in some application, and so it's just indeterminate. Another reason is just sort of lack of consensus or indeterminacy in the rule of recognition itself. Hart's general diagnosis of that case is that in such a case, right, actors, judges are not legally constrained, but that doesn't mean they're wholly normatively free. They're guided by moral considerations. At that case, they're legally free to act just on their moral sense of the case. And so that would be the Harting diagnosis of this case here, right, which is that if it's really true, as I believe it is, that the rule of recognition, the Hartian sense, is pluralistic, so what that means is that one of the modalities not on the list is legally prohibited, right? So for example, deciding constitutional cases with reference to preventing climate change would be legally prohibited, right? That's not on the list of modalities. But that use of any one of the modalities is legally permitted. And then a judge who does so can be criticized by her brethren as being morally misguided. And indeed, such moral criticism over time might change the rule of recognition, right? That's the Hartian answer. And I don't see why you can't just help yourself to that.
Richard?
Oh, just briefly, I just wanted to go back to David's question about the Cummings excerpt you had there. When Larry said that the Constitution is not a Cummings poem, you seem to accept that in stride. And I was a little bit surprised by that, given that I thought you had rested a philosophical claim about language based on the poem. So I just wanted to give you a chance maybe to elaborate on what you thought you were giving away or not giving away by that.
On the New Deal revolution, right? I'm not sure, and I don't know descriptively to the extent the modalities changed in the New Deal, but supposing they did, right? Supposing they did, then that would be a revolution. I mean, if they've changed by fiat of Owen Roberts or something, right? That would be, I think, a bad act, right? That would be a revolutionary kind of act, not of the kind that my thin normative account likes, right? So yes, that, and what was the first part of that? I just got to focus on that. What was the first part of the question? Not about the revolution, but.
Well, it was a question about how we think about this from an interpretive perspective and from a normative perspective.
Yeah, right. So from the interpretive perspective, I would say that was illegitimate sort of modal reform in the interpretive practice, right? That was sort of and maybe it wouldn't, and I guess it would depend over time, when maybe we have just said, oh, that was fine, we all agree on that, right? But if I was at the moment doing that, I would be the guy doing the interregnum, right? I would be saying, you have interposed your own views into the lived practice of how we do this, right? So I think you're right there on that. I agree that you put it much better than I have, and with more heart references. So I like that. And I'm.
Our sense is that judges have these zones where they make law, but again, it's not. I think that's a closer position of what the Supreme Court does. I mean, I think the note, which hasn't come up today, but is that.
Let's let.
No, please.
That the rule of recognition for judges other than the Supreme Court is follow the Supreme Court. So that's powerfully constraining, right? The reason we don't have chaos with this kind of pluralism is that everyone else listens to the Supreme Court. So we're talking about a kind of, Supreme Court lawmaking guided by the judge's own sense, the Supreme Court justice's own sense of moral considerations. That, I think, is, whether that's morally attractive is another question, but that's, I think, a plausible description of the stable practice we have now.
Amen. Cummings' poem, Richard. No, and maybe I hate to disappoint, but my claim there was simple, and maybe I started out with something else in mind, but the ending claim was simply to show that there are different kinds of games that don't depend on intentionalism to the degree that some other games do, that are different from the Gricean paradigm, right? And maybe those aren't that different. Maybe you could argue about whether there's some kind of declarative intention or obfuscation intention, all that stuff going on, and there's still intentionalism there. But the idea was simply to show that not all interpretation involves that kind of act, right? And that this, not that constitutional law is the same, I don't think it is, but that it could also be different from the Gricean conversation.
And Larry.
Just if I could say, Ian, I'm not sure you really want to help yourself to Matt's suggestion, because it depends on how serious you are about sort of the Bobbitt-Patterson way of thinking about these things. But the suggestion that Matt makes, that's just completely inconsistent with first of all, it's a theory that goes outside of the language game. It's an external theory, so it's not permitted into legal discourse, right? If you're really going to accept Patterson and Bobbitt, there is no legal philosophy modality, right? In fact, the whole point is to keep that stuff out, right? So I just think that if you want to go the heart route, you're going to have to, this paper is going to have to start from the beginning again, and every single argument is going to have to be made in a different way. So I do not think this is a friendly suggestion. This is a radically unfriendly suggestion.
That's actually, I hadn't thought, that's a fair point.
Okay. And we are still doing okay on time, a few more minutes. Judge McConnell and then Larry Alexander. Judge.
So I'm a little confused about what kind of paper this is, what kind of point is being made. And it seems to me that there's a difference between an external and an internal view within the law. That is, if you're a political scientist and you're trying to figure out what is American law? This idea that it's a practice is probably pretty useful, and it is what it is, and you have a description of what it is, and you've done something very helpful for a political scientist. And all that's perfectly coherent. But I think if you think about it as an internal matter, you're the judge, it's completely useless. So you tell the judge, law is what judges do. It is what it is. And the judge says, okay, but how am I supposed to decide the case, right? Because from an internal point of view, it's just, this just doesn't get you anywhere. And so from an internal point of view, you have these various modalities, and you've got to choose between them and have a reason that's at least persuasive to yourself about why you use one or another. And so if Bobbitt's view is that these are really flat and that there is no reason for having, I don't think they have to be exclusive. I do think that they should be, there should be some method for deciding when one takes priority over another, and that has to be reasonably consistent. If they are really flat, then there's one modality only, and that is, how do I want the case to come out? I mean, it's just politics, and then the modality is just what the words you use. There's only law going on, it seems to me, if there's some reason why we consistently take one of these approaches rather than another, and that requires some kind of normative argument, whether it's based upon what words mean, or democracy, or preventing tyranny, or getting us, or as Mark Tushnet suggested, getting us to socialism. I mean, whatever it is, we need some kind of a normative argument for why we do this, and it just doesn't seem to me very helpful to say, well, it's a practice.
Yeah, well, actually, this is what Michael said was essentially tracking what I was going to say. The practice theory has got to be from an external point of view. Inside, it's like saying, if a Martian came down and looked at physicists arguing about the cosmos, whether it's 10 strings or, and goes back and reports that physics is a practice of arguing about, these things. There's a there apparently that people argue about in physics. And when you have a legal argument, I've never understood the Bobbitt thing, especially since it's not lexically ordered, the modality. So there they are, litigant one says, I'm arguing this according to the original meaning of this text. Litigant two says, no, I'm arguing this based on if this text if it had been written by my favorite normative philosopher, and it's a different. And so the judge says, can you give me a reason why I should pick the originalist text over the normative text or some other one of the other modality texts? And they say, well, no, because we don't have. There's nothing out. There's no master modality here. So what's the judge going to do? So how do you write the opinion? I chose the originalist text this time. Of course, I chose the other text some other time. There's no argument there, and that's why that isn't the practice. That couldn't be the practice. That's not what people do when they're in court arguing about the Constitution. Now, and there's another thing about the sort of the know-how versus knowing, that kind of argument. I've seen that Brian Leiter wrote a piece a few years ago in the Yale Law Journal that was, he's got some affinity for the legal realists, and so he was trying to make this argument about judges' know-how. The problem is, you have to have some sort of external test to know whether the judges actually do know. It just, obviously they can decide a case, but whether they decided it correctly is a matter. You have to have some standard external to that. And I don't see that Bobbitt can supply anything like that.
We're Actually, just a little bit over the time, so I think we'll probably leave further discussions for afterward. But thank you very much again to Ian.